Welcome to Kick Weekly with Tim Wheaton. I'm your host, Tim Wheaton, covering off all the latest news and fights in the world of kickboxing. Folks, I appreciate you being here. Last week, there wasn't really any major fights, and upcoming this weekend, there isn't any major fights as well. So I'm just trying to figure out what to talk about today. So what I figure I'm going to do is talk about some of the origins of K-1 Kickboxing, both how both talking about the style and the promotion itself, the philosophy behind a lot of promotional ideas, as well as how important Ernesto Hoost was. For many listeners, this is information that they probably already know, and for a lot of people, maybe this is new information. But it opens the discussion up to talk about how important this time was for combat sports and how it's still how that time really still influences what's going on in today's kickboxing. Because K-1 Kickboxing is both a style as well as it is a promotion. But the thing is that we refer to the K-1 kickboxing style as the default form of kickboxing, and in reality that's not the case. There's loads of forms of kickboxing. When we refer to kickboxing, it is typically K-1, but things like Waco, WKA, and ISKA do have K-1 titles, and any promotion that exists today, such as One Championship, Rise, K-1 of course, or Glory, are using essentially what K-1 rules are. So let's get into where these rules came from, what the philosophy was, what promotions are doing today, and all that sort of stuff. This is going to be kind of a loose talk, kind of an unstructured talk, and hopefully you folks like it. But let's go back to the very first K-1 Grand Prix tournament in 1993 in Tokyo, Japan. So in 1993, I don't know exactly what was going on in the worldwide, whether people were so inspired by things like Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat and whatever else was going on in martial arts movies, but I think it's safe to say that in 1993, people were horny for fights. People were horny for mixed rules fights in 1993 because PANCRASE, the UFC, and K-1 Kickboxing were all founded within a few months of each other, which is an incredible coincidence that if you look back in history, it looks like they all coordinated to come up with ideas of mixed rules fighting. But that's not the case. They were all very separate entities who didn't even know that the others existed and were in fact kind of surprised by what the other people were doing. And eventually, when the three found out about each other, they did exchange a lot of fighters. PANCRASE in the UFC, of course, shared people like Ken Shamrock. K-1 in the UFC shared tons of fighters. But yeah, PANCRASE was founded based on kind of a natural progression of professional wrestling. The founders then, it was a split from, I kind of forget exactly what it was, but Ken Shamrock wrote about it in his book of the people that the major professional wrestling organization at the time had a major split, and it went two different ways. And one of the ways it went was with Masakatsu Funaki and his partner, and they founded PANCRASE. And it was more like if professional wrestling was real, this is what it would look like. We're going to have real grappling and stuff like that. And eventually Boss Rutan was brought in to bring in a real weight behind the striking, and it changed the sport altogether. The UFC, of course, infamously had the philosophy of this: if there are no rules, what is the best martial arts? And they were trying to promote Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and eventually they came to the conclusion that it's probably Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is the best martial art according to the system that they came up with. K-1 Kickboxing was a lot closer to what the UFC was trying to do. Let's look at all the striking martial arts currently going on, and let's devise a neutral system for all these martial arts to compete. And then we can start asking the question as what striking martial art is truly best. So let's go back to 1993 and what kind of stuff was going on. There was a European style kickboxing, which didn't allow knees or elbows or clinching. It was just kicks, low kicks, and punches. There was American full contact kickboxing, which didn't allow low kicks. It was just body kicks and punches. There was also Kyokushin Karate, which didn't allow strikes to the head. There was also Muay Thai, which allowed, of course, the art of 8 limbs, which allowed clinching, elbows, knees, everything such as that. There was also French Savate, which allowed only 4 kinds of kicks at the time. So K-1, the owners of K-1 were looking at all this and looking at so if you have a Kung Fu fighter versus a Kyokushin Karate fighter, whatever sport they compete in is the one that's going to win, right? A kickboxer versus a Muay Thai fighter in Muay Thai, it's always going to be a Muay Thai fighter. A Muay Thai fighter facing a full contact kickboxer in full contact kickboxing, probably the full contact kickboxer is going to win 9 times out of 10 because the rules will always favor the sport, essentially. It's like asking who wins in a tennis match, a tennis player or a baseball player. Don't be stupid. It's a tennis player, right? So K1 was trying to devise a way, a neutral rule system for all of these striking arts to compete with one another. So when we come up with the K1 rules, we'll allow some clinching, one strike with one hand. You can do no elbows. You can do knees. You can catch kicks, but you must release it after one strike. You can do punches, low kicks, all that sort of stuff. And that way, each of these striking martial arts, from Savate and Muay Thai, European kickboxing, American kickboxing, they will have some rules in their favor, and they will have some rules working against them. And then what that ended up creating, because it's a neutral system for so many striking martial arts, what that ended up creating is, rather than it being a testing ground for all these striking martial arts, it became the standard rule set for 30 years now. So anytime that we talk about kickboxing, again, Glory, One, Rise, and K1 are all based on this system that was meant to be a neutral ground for things like Muay Thai and full contact and European kickboxing and things like this. So what is K1 Kickboxing? So K1 Kickboxing is, of course, an organization as well as a unique style. So you can have K1 martial arts. You can train K1. You can be an amateur K1 champion while never competing within K1. You can go on their website right now and get a K1 license to put on a K1 licensed event or a K1 licensed gym or whatever it might be. But essentially, the K1 has just become a ubiquitous name for neutral striking. And then, of course, over time, what ends up happening is that fighters stop training in their unique style, such as Kyokushin Karate or such as Muay Thai, and start focusing more training around K1 rules. And that is where fighters are today, is that fighters who grew up on K1 rules, they've trained K1 rules for their entire life, and then they compete under essentially K1 rules. Even if Glory, Rise, K1, and One have slightly different rule sets, they're all loosely based off of K1 rules as the base for all of this stuff. But back in the day, of course, they were separate gyms who more so focused Kyokushin or Savate or Muay Thai or whatever it might be, and eventually adapted to K1 rules. So you got fighters after a few years, like guys like Peter Arts and these types, Peter Arts and Andy Hugh, who adapted their style for K1. And then ultimately what ended up happening is that K1 became the default testing ground for the best strikers on earth. So to answer the question of what is the best striking martial arts, it is not a clean-cut answer. We would love to have a fun little answer and just say, oh, it's Kyokushin Karate because Semi-Shell dominated it, in both sports, or it's clearly Muay Thai because Buakao dominated in these sports, or whatever it might be. The best fighters were the ones who could adapt their original style under K1 rules, or they were a fighter who seemed to be designed to fight under K1 rules. And this is where we meet Ernesto Hoost. So Ernesto Hoost, or Ernesto Hoost as most people in English would refer him, his actual pronunciation is Ernesto Hoost. What he was at that time, if you go back and look at his records before K1 existed, if you look at what Ernesto was doing, it looks like he was built for K1 fighting. And let me explain what this looks like. So before 1993, he was competing in European kickboxing, which he held a championship in. He was competing in Muay Thai, which he held a championship in. He competed under full contact American kickboxing as well. And he also held a championship in French Savate. So he had all of these styles under his belt already, as well as his main coaches at that time, people like Johan Voss and Jan Plas. They were among the first people to be trained under Kyokushin Karate. So Mas Oyama was the founder of Kyokushin Karate, and some of his first students were Johan Voss and Jan Plas. And these guys took the ideas of Kyokushin Karate, and they didn't exactly love Kyokushin Karate. They became masters of it and stuff like that, and then eventually turned their back. And then they traveled back to the Netherlands with essentially a slightly different style, kind of connected to the Majiro gym. It's not clear on how these things all interconnect, but essentially these guys went back to the Netherlands with some ideas of Kyokushin Karate and some ideas of kickboxing, and then began adapting the style. So now we get back to Ernesto Hoost. So his coaches were among the founders of Kyokushin Karate, in addition to his French Savate, Muay Thai, American kickboxing, European kickboxing connections. So now this guy, Ernesto Hoost, starts looking like the man who was created and made in a lab to dominate K1 kickboxing. And another name for guys trained under Mas Oyama who are influential for Dutch style kickboxing, John Blooming as well. I don't want to leave any names out, and it's sometimes the story doesn't clearly connect, but I know I don't want to leave any names out for you people who are listening. So these people essentially got back to the Netherlands after training Kyokushin Karate. and began training their own style of kickboxing. And this style of kickboxing, you could call it K-1 Kickboxing. It would be much more accurate to call it Dutch style kickboxing. And Dutch style kickboxing is a little bit difficult to label. So I've tried writing articles about it where we are accurately defining, here is exactly what Dutch style kickboxing is. But Dutch style kickboxing is not very distant from K-1 kickboxing. But here's the thing, when you try to define something very accurately, the more difficult it becomes to define that thing accurately. So there's kickboxing, and then there's subsports within kickboxing, such as Muay Thai and K1. And Muay Thai and K1 can be accurately defined by the rules, but then there's sub-styles within each of those rule systems. So in Muay Thai, you can talk about Muay Sock and Muay Mat punchers. That doesn't always explain the full picture because a Muay Mat style fighter will have all the other facets, but it's just an idea used to describe some fighters. Same with under K1 kickboxing, there's Dutch style kickboxing. And when you give them a definition, it doesn't always accurately define exactly what that fighter is doing. It just gives you a general idea. Same with under the sport of boxing. When you talk, people have the idea of like Mexican style boxing. Mexican style boxing doesn't always exactly accurately describe the style. It just gives you the general idea of how to imagine how a person goes about fighting. So let's go about what is the exact definition of Dutch style kickboxing. The exact definition of Dutch style kickboxing is a style of kickboxing which incorporates heavy punching combinations finished with low kicks. So you're going to listen to that definition and say that's extremely vague and barely describes anything. But yes, all we're doing is describing a style. And again, the more you study it and the more you look at it, the less accurate it becomes. So when we talk about Dutch style kickboxing, quite often the people that we're trying to describe are people who are like Peter Arts, Ernesto Hoost, Ramon Dekkers, and then you can add people like Bas Rutten, Gokhan Saki if you wanted to, Alistair Overeem to an extent. And then we start running into problems of like, so remember, this is just a sub-style of kickboxing. A lot of those guys aren't even kickboxers. A lot of them are Muay Thai or MMA fighters. And then a lot of them, by that definition, barely even fit the definition of Dutch style kickboxing. So we made a definition to explain how guys like Peter Arts fight. And then that definition doesn't even really explain how he fights. Because if you look at the heavy punches and ended with leg kicks and combinations, and then you shell up and you wait for your opponent to throw a combination and then you yourself respond with a combination, that's essentially Dutch style kickboxing. That describes Rodtang Jim Wongnong a lot more than it explains Ernesto Hoost. Now you start seeing problems with the more you try to define this exact thing, the harder it gets to define. So I would say don't overthink when people say Dutch style kickboxing, don't overthink it. Just please, for the love of God, don't overthink it. Just make it so much simpler in your head if you're just like, right, that's like a handful of guys like Peter Arts and Ernesto Hoost, I guess. And one of the really cool things about some of these legacy organizations like PANCRASE to an extent and K1 quite heavily, let me explain something else and then we'll get back to fight sport. But a while ago, I was watching the PGA golf tournament, and I don't watch PGA golf. I don't care. But I was watching it on TV, and they had a highlight reel starting from the very first PGA tournament, going through all the major moments in golf history, all the unforgettable and important things that happened, and then got to today's tournament and where we're standing in today's tournament and what really matters here. And by doing that, it made you as the viewer feel like you were watching a part of history, that you were a part of this unbroken chain of great lineage, of amazing moments. And today we are witnessing another piece in that history that is vital to the sport. And when you look at the way that UFC promotes fights, they don't do this at all. They're always, what are you doing for me now? What happened now? What is going to happen in the future? When you watch the UFC, despite it being 30 years old now, you don't get the feeling that you're watching this unbroken lineage going back 30 years of martial arts philosophy and martial arts growth, starting with the Gracie philosophy. And if you want to go back like really far into the UFC's history, you can go as far back as samurai practicing jiu-jitsu and sumo, and then we get into judo, and then getting to the Gracies in Brazil, and then the Gracies in the UFC. So you can have this really cool unbroken lineage going back hundreds of years, and the UFC decides not to promote it that way. Even if you had the best fight of 2021, you're already in the past. You're forgotten. It doesn't matter. If you had the best fight of last year, it doesn't really mean all that much. It never feels like you're watching a part of history. It's just what is right now and what is happening. K1 is almost on the opposite end of that promotion, where all they're doing is looking back in the past to be like, look at how great we were, and now we're a part of that history today. Even though K1 is certainly not an unbroken lineage, It is very much a broken lineage going back to 1993, but they kind of go on the opposite end to look back and say, we're still trying to do all these great things that we did in the past. We're trying to do these things today. I do wish K1 all the best in their endeavors because I love the sport and I love what they do. And I do like how they promote it as well. So I'm wishing them the absolute best. But yeah, it's just promotional differences. And it's not a right or wrong thing, because you could also argue that people in combat sports are looking back far too much. Like a bunch of us weirdos always talk about old K1 and Pride FC. And like, this stuff was 15 years ago. And like, maybe we should get over it. And you could absolutely have an argument. You could make an argument about that we are looking back in the past just way, way too much, right? But what they were trying to do back in 1993 that went on for decades, it was so influential that these styles are unbreakable at this point, right? Imagine like they tried to come up with a neutral ground for striking arts, and it itself became the default fighting style for people for decades going forward. So the ideas behind K1 kickboxing, while they are a set of rules, they are a style. In 25 years, if you look at kickboxing, they're probably still doing K1 kickboxing, even if K1 doesn't exist, even if Glory doesn't exist. It's just insane to think about. Now, of course, when we look at the history of K1, there's going to be a lot of names that I probably forgot, or things that were extremely important, like Saido Kaikan, I didn't even mention as well, the importance of that. I think the best thing about Saido Kaikan is that they would end draws by punching through bricks, and I think maybe we should bring that back. But just do various objects around your house. Let's go to a draw round, and if it's still not resolved at a draw round, who can punch through an original Xbox? I don't know. Who can punch through original GameCube? Maybe other things that aren't video game related. I don't know. Maybe you go to a round of Smash Bros or something like that. Just like different stuff that maybe isn't directly related to fighting, but we need to get draw fights resolved anyway. But yeah, that's kind of it for this week. We're just going to do a loose talk on what is the philosophy of K1 fighting, Ernesto Hoost, Promotional Philosophies. But folks, let me know what I forgot. What are some of the important things that I left out? We're always here to learn and learn more. And then the important stuff, comment down below and I'll talk about it next week. But yeah, folks, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for tuning in and talking about these things with me. My name's Tim Wheaton. Thank you for joining me for Kick Weekly with Tim Wheaton. And folks, we will be back same time next week.